Imagine you're a soldier. You've just survived a medieval battle. The fighting is over. You're exhausted, bleeding, surrounded by the dead. And then someone puts a sword to your throat. Not to kill you, to take you prisoner. Now here's the question nobody asks. What happens next? Because the answer isn't what you think. It isn't a cell, it isn't a dungeon. For some men, being captured was the beginning of a nightmare that lasted years. For others, it was actually the best thing that could have happened to them. And for thousands, it ended in a massacre that history books barely mention. This is what really happened to prisoners of war in the Middle Ages. The first thing you need to understand about medieval warfare is this. Your survival had nothing to do with mercy. It had everything to do with money. From the earliest days of medieval Europe, a system existed called ransom. The idea was simple. If you captured an enemy soldier, especially a nobleman, a knight, or an officer, you didn't kill him. You held him until his family paid for his release. This sounds almost civilized, but think about what it actually meant in practice. You were property. Your captor owned you the moment you surrendered. He fed you just enough to keep you alive, kept you locked up, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, while your family scrambled to gather the money. The ransoms demanded were not small. The son of the constable of Richmond Castle had to pay 200 marks after his father's castle was seized in 1216. That was an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to years of income for most families. And if your family couldn't raise the money in time, you stayed. Some prisoners rotted in captivity for a decade. Some died before anyone came for them. The French King John was captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. He was held for 4 years. His ransom, 3 million gold crowns. It nearly bankrupted the entire kingdom of France. So yes, the ransom system existed, but calling it civilized would be a stretch. Here's where it gets darker. Because everything I just told you, the ransoms, the negotiations, the years of captivity, that was only for the nobility. If you were a common soldier, a foot soldier, an archer, a mercenary, the rules were completely different. You had no ransom value, no rich family waiting to buy you back, no political importance that made keeping you alive worth the trouble. So what happened to you? 2 options, slavery or death. Slavery in medieval Europe was not the same institution as what we associate with later centuries, but it was real, it was brutal, and it was entirely legal. Captured soldiers from lower classes could be put to work on estates, in mines, on construction projects. They had no rights, no timeline, no guarantee of ever seeing their home again. And death was often the more common outcome. Medieval battlefields were chaotic and expensive. Feeding prisoners cost money. Guarding them took men away from fighting. If there was no profit in keeping you alive, there often wasn't a strong reason to try. Mass beheadings of common soldiers after battles were not unusual. They were documented. They were accepted. When the Welsh captured an English castle in 1212, every single prisoner was beheaded. The English were doing exactly the same to Welsh prisoners. Both sides considered it completely normal. Your social class in the Middle Ages didn't just determine how you lived. It determined whether you survived losing a battle. Now let's talk about sieges, because sieges had their own set of rules, and they were arguably the most brutal situation a prisoner of war could find themselves in. When an army besieged a castle or a city, there was an accepted procedure. The defenders could surrender early and be treated relatively well. But if they chose to resist, if they held out, forced the attackers to spend weeks or months outside the walls, losing men and resources, then all bets were off. Medieval military law actually formalized this. By the 14th century, it was written into the chivalric codes of warfare. If a fortification resisted and was then taken by force, the besiegers had the legal right to slaughter everyone inside. Everyone. Not just the soldiers, the civilians too. Women, children, servants, anyone inside those walls when they fell. This wasn't considered a war crime. It was considered a legitimate military tactic. The threat of total annihilation was the tool used to convince cities to surrender without a fight. And it worked, regularly. When it didn't work, when a city held out and then fell, the results were catastrophic. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099, during the First Crusade, left the streets reportedly running with blood. Contemporary accounts describe crusaders wading through bodies, tens of thousands killed in a single day. Prisoners? Almost none. There was no mercy for those who had forced the attackers to fight for every inch. Of all the stories from medieval warfare, this one might be the most disturbing, because it involves one of history's most celebrated military heroes and one of the most cold-blooded massacres ever ordered on a battlefield. October 25th, 1415, the Battle of Agincourt. Henry V of England faced a French army massively larger than his own. Against all odds, the English won. The French nobility was cut down in enormous numbers, and thousands of French knights and soldiers were taken prisoner. For a moment, it looked like the greatest ransom payday in English history. The prisoners alone were worth a fortune. Then, something changed. A report reached Henry that a French force was attacking the English baggage camp behind the lines. Henry panicked. He was already outnumbered. If the prisoners, thousands of armored knights, decided to rejoin the fight, the English would be finished. So Henry gave an order: kill the prisoners, all of them. His own knights refused, not out of mercy, out of greed. These men were worth money. Killing them was throwing away a fortune. Henry's nobility literally defied his command. So Henry appointed a group of archers, men who had no stake in the ransoms, and ordered them to carry out the killing instead. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. Thousands of French prisoners, many of them already wounded, were killed where they stood. One French survivor described how he and other prisoners were locked inside a house, and then the house was set on fire. The men who burned alive that day were not enemy combatants. The battle was already over. They were prisoners, unarmed, surrendered. Henry V, the hero of Agincourt. The king celebrated in Shakespeare. He ordered that. The situation was even more extreme during the Crusades, where religious difference added another layer of brutality to an already brutal system. Christians captured by Muslim forces during the Crusades faced a specific fate. If they could not pay a ransom, they were either killed or sold into slavery. The Islamic world had its own sophisticated ransom networks. There were even professional negotiators whose entire job was arranging the release of captives across religious lines. But when ransom failed, the outcome was usually permanent. Enslaved Crusader prisoners could end up working in fields, galleys, or households across the Middle East and North Africa, with no realistic hope of return. It worked in the other direction too. Christians captured Muslim soldiers and treated them exactly the same way. The Crusades were not a clash of civilization against barbarism. They were two sides using identical methods, justified by different religions, against each other. The prisoners in the middle had very little say in any of it. Here's what strikes me most about all of this. We have spent centuries building a romantic image of medieval warfare: the knight, the code of honor, the rules of chivalry, the idea that even war had dignity. And pieces of that were real. The ransom system was real. Some prisoners were treated well. Some were even comfortable in captivity. But underneath all of it was a simple, brutal logic. Your life was worth exactly what someone could get for it. The moment that value dropped to zero, so did your chance of survival. Henry V is still celebrated as one of England's greatest kings. Agincourt is still taught as a triumph. The prisoners who burned alive in that house barely get a footnote. The Middle Ages were not a time of honor and glory dressed up in armor. They were a time when the difference between being ransomed and being burned alive could come down to a single panicked decision by a king who was afraid of losing. That is the real history of prisoners of war, and it is far darker than anything they put in the history books.